Okay, so you're an artist and you're wondering if you should study art history. So the question would be, does learning art history make you a better artist? And so the answer is, it depends. Basically, learning all this little minutia won't help that much. So, for example, like, oh, this artist might have been gay. This artist grew up in a small town and then moved to Paris. Or this artist had a hobby on the side doing this. Like, a lot of these minutiae don't really help you to be a better artist. You might just be interested in it because you're like, oh, I wonder what Leonardo da Vinci did as a hobby. So you might be interested in it, but that's not going to make you a better artist necessarily. So the way that studying art history can be helpful, or is definitely helpful, is it's a utility belt. For example, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Rembrandt. These are all artists in your tool belt. And so you can draw upon them when you're drawing. So when you're looking at a hand, if you can mentally, if you've looked at these artists enough, you can mentally think, how would Rembrandt draw this? How would Michelangelo draw this? And you can go through the Rolodex in your mind. If you know what they look like and you've studied them, then you can be like, how would they draw this? And so that can be useful because depending on what you're trying to communicate, you might take a different artist out of that tool belt. So a hand from, like, I don't know, like this angle, you might say, or like this, right? You might say, oh, that really reminds me of the Sistine Chapel. So you might pull out Michelangelo from your tool belt and be like, oh, I'm going to draw it like Michelangelo would draw it. Or say you want to draw it really in like a not junky. Junky's the wrong word, but a very humble looking hand, like the hand of a peasant or something. You might channel Van Gogh or Van Gogh, Van Gogh, a Van Gogh hand when he draws the hands of the peasants, right? You might channel more of that, right? Or you can say, well, this, or you're looking at your art and you're saying, well, my hand isn't looking very good. What's the difference between the way I'm doing it and how Raphael would do it? So then you can go look at Raphael and say, oh, I see. He uses these lines and shades with the form, and he actually doesn't use a super hard line to outline the shadows like I'm doing it, which is giving me a flat feel to it. He actually just leaves the shadows open, and he actually does it very lightly. And if you have the shadows in the right place, then so you're giving yourself a lot of references. And this goes back to what I was talking about, I think it was probably last week, with your taste, right? So having these references to call upon, like a utility belt. So you can say, ooh, Steve Houston. I remember Steve Houston drew that fingertip like a box, so I'm going to draw it like that. Or you could say, oh, but this other artist would draw it like this. So you just give yourself a lot more tools to work with art history. And the other thing you could learn about with art history is what's been done before, right? So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. For example, Impressionism. You don't have to go to Impressionism. You don't have to teach yourself Impressionism from the bottom up. You can just look at the people who did Impressionism best, and not even just one person. You can look at the top 10 Impressionists and pick the best one from each, and then create your own. In fact, this is a really good activity to go to Google Drive and create a folder and save all the top 10 Impressionism works, and maybe do a study, like one study per day of Impressionism, and then you steal those styles. You steal the best of all those artists, and you're like, okay, well, now I've got a little Impressionism in my tool belt. Right, so just think about all these things, all this art history. They're just references to go into your tool belt. They give you more options for drawing. It's not just like, oh, this is just how I draw. This is my style. No, it's like, do I want to go for more of this kind of a mood or this kind of a mood? For this subject matter, which artist do I want to call upon? Which artist do I want to channel in order to draw this in a certain way to communicate what I'm trying to communicate? So art history isn't, you don't need to learn every detail. You don't even really need to memorize dates, although maybe you could learn a little bit about, here's modernism, and here's postmodernism, and how did modernism go into modernism, and how did modernism go into postmodernism, and what are these artists like? If you're interested in that kind of stuff. I'm personally not really interested in like postmodernism stuff. All I knew was I wasn't really interested in it. I learned enough about it to learn that I think it was a cool thing at the time, but I kind of think it's been done, and so now we can move on from it. That's sort of what my take on postmodernism is. But cool that it exists. You can reference it, and with modernism, you can look at it and be like, okay, there's some cool ideas, because Matisse teaches us a lot about light, and he's got a lot of cool stuff going on with color. There's a lot of play there, but do I really like the way he draws things? No, not really. So maybe I take some color information from Matisse. Maybe I take some lighting information from Matisse. Maybe I take some shapes or colors or playfulness from Picasso, right? Maybe I take some experimental notes from Picasso. I don't know, whatever you want. So it's good to know. It's especially good to know the artists in your field. I wouldn't say you need to learn about the history of architecture if you're going into illustration, but you should definitely know the Golden Age illustrators. You should pick out the ones that you like the most, and you should look at their best paintings, and you should study those if you want to give yourself the greatest amount of artistic freedom. Because the more you know, the more access you have to, the more options you have as an artist. So, and to look at these and study these gives you a lot more power and freedom as an artist. So yeah, I think that's pretty much, the only thing I want to say is, as you go in, if you pick up an art history textbook, you're going to have so much stuff, which if you're not an art history major, if you're not trying to be the curator at a museum, you don't really need to know. For example, like Maya Lin designed like the Vietnam War Memorial. I don't really need to know that if I'm trying to be an illustrator, right? It's not necessary for me. It might just be a fun fact to have, right? You might want to learn a little bit about the history of architecture and how skyscrapers were first designed, but it's not really necessary to learn the history of architecture if you're not going to be an architect. And it's not really necessary to learn the history of printmaking if you're not going to be a printmaker. Same thing for, like, if you're a painter, you don't need to learn the history of sculpture. It won't hurt you to learn this stuff, but you should focus your efforts on just the greatest painters. You don't need to learn every fact of every painter's life. So you can probably take like 5%, right? So just take all of art history, right? Just figure out the best artists from each movement, kind of get the summary of each movement, right? Look at so like Romanticism or Fauvism. Just look through these, see which ones, look at the art from them, see which ones interest you, and then find the best artists from those movements, the ones that really stand out to you, put them in a folder, and just look at those images and study from those. So it's like if art history is a pile of sand or something, or say it's like sand, and then it's got these chunks of gold in it. So you just take your filter and you're just pouring the sand through the filter, and what's left is like the gold, right? So you just want to take those gold chunks, and that's the stuff you're interested in, and just study those. You don't have to learn everything about art history. Just like if you want to be an MMA fighter, if you want to fight in the octagon, right? You don't need to learn every single traditional martial art, and you don't need to learn the history of all the martial arts in the history of combat. You don't need to know all that. All you need to know is this technique works. Punching someone in the face works. This combination of strikes works. These kicks are good. These punches are good. These submissions are good. These takedowns are good. That's what you need to know. You need to know the stuff that helps you to fight better. You don't need to know the history of it all. If you want to learn that, go for it. It won't hurt you. And because you're interested in it, you might just enjoy that. And that's fine. And it keeps your mind on art, and that's great. So there's nothing wrong with learning more about art history if you're interested in it. You'll probably be a little bit better for it, but not substantially. As in, you should invest way more time studying and making art than studying art history. So that's all I have to say about that. Take what's useful and leave the rest behind. Just skim the surface and get the best stuff, and that's how I would do it. All right, see you next time.